Hi. So I'm really pleased to see that so many of you have returned for round two, and I hope you aren't all too tired this afternoon. So a few people have asked me how I'm doing with the jet lag, and I have to say it's not a myth, it is real. And I keep getting the same response from everyone, and every time people say, "Oh, you don't look tired, you look really well," and I'm thinking, well, I've got a lot of makeup on plastered on my face right now, so I should hope I look well. And I have to say, I've never been to a conference before with this much energy, and it's been really beautiful to see. Last night at the dinner, I was pushed to dance in between two rows of lots of people, and they weren't pointing and laughing at me, they were just cheering me on. And I've never been to a conference where that's happened. Actually, I've just never been anywhere where that's happened before. So that's been really nice. So thank you for sharing this experience with me. I've also had quite a few people come up and ask me about their interest in using the RECCAP in their particular services, or just generally they've got a couple of questions that they wanted to talk to me about. So please come find me this afternoon or even tomorrow afternoon. I will still be around, but bear in mind that I am going to be traveling New Zealand for the next month and a bit, so I'm sure I can perhaps bump into you in your own cities, and that's completely fine. But I also won't take offense if you do see me and don't say hi, because chances are you're not going to recognize me without my heels and my makeup on. So this presentation follows on from what we spoke about yesterday, but instead it looks at how we build connections using the RECCAP tool as a systematic measure of recovery. So the RECCAP is an assessments tool which is based on over 10 years worth of research, and we'll look and understand why it is a positive method to use in tracking someone's journey. So we covered some of these methods yesterday, and I'm briefly just going to recap what we went through just to jog your memories. And again, with yesterday's presentation, this tool is applicable to individuals from different groups in various different types of settings, but I will primarily focus on individuals going through a recovery journey where they're trying to overcome substance misuse or offending behavior. So I'll use certain examples, one that's based in Florida, where the RECCAP is currently being used, and one which is based in a prison in the north of England. So the RECCAP is based on recovery capital, which is something that we use as a measure for change. And I'll talk a lot more about this today. We briefly touched on social capital yesterday, and I'll also be revealing some unpublished data that we have from the work that's been done in Florida, so nobody else has actually seen this yet, so that's quite exciting. So let's start with review. So yesterday we talked about, so I'm just going to move this down. We defined recovery as a voluntarily maintained lifestyle categorized by sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. And that was the Betty Ford Institute definition. The UK Drug Policy Commission have also defined recovery, but they've defined it as a voluntarily sustained control over substance use, which maximizes health and well-being and participation in rights, roles, and responsibilities of society. So both definitions are quite similar, but they both have three important parts to it, and that's that we're looking at well-being, quality of life, and a measure of community engagement, as well as a measure of sobriety. So the main argument yesterday was that social networks are crucial for individuals who wish to sustain recovery. And the most important thing to recall around this is the transitioning process that takes place with a person's social identity, which makes recovery much easier to maintain. So we talked about the social identity model, and that was based on two key theories which complement each other. They basically argue that the groups we affiliate ourselves with the most are incredibly important, as that's how we get our norms, values, and beliefs. So identifying yourself with a group that also identifies themselves in recovery or shares those similar norms is critical. And it doesn't mean that an individual completely cuts out those groups who are still using, because as we know, they might still have strong bonds with them, which isn't necessarily a negative thing, because those groups might encompass family members and close friends. But it just means that the belonging to a group has a powerful impact on your sense of self. So we talked about the example of AA, and we demonstrated how an individual who becomes an active member in such a recovery group can make this shift and transition. And we also spoke about loneliness and how that's become a widespread global concern. And we know from the Harvard study that had tracked people over a lifetime that connections are beneficial both for our psychological and our physical health. We talked about connection being a basic human need, and that if we can use practical and measurable methods to connect people to prevent and tackle issues of loneliness. And the practical measures included asset mapping, development of community connectors, and assertive linkage. So asset mapping, we talked about the difference between, I don't know if you remember the slide with the sheep on in Scotland, and the difference between the assets that were available in that community compared to those, for example, in New York. And we spoke about how important it is to have people who can identify and mobilize those. And that was through the development of community connectors, which was people who were in sustained recovery, who worked as community connectors to find all these assets within their area. And assertive linkage was what brought it all together. So we also learned that people out of addiction have a better quality of life than those who have never had a recovery journey, because they're twice as likely to be active members in their community. Therefore, it is better to have people in your community in recovery than it's not. And that's a statement that I'd like to see get plastered around everywhere, to try and shift this awful stigma that can still get placed on people who have or have had addiction problems, because they're the ones that will actually enrich your community. So another thing that I'd like to recap on from yesterday is that these three methods are based on accessing strengths that usually already exist within your community, and this inspires hope. So we're not recovering illnesses, we're recovering strengths, and we're using hope to encourage and support recovery journeys. So in this process, clients are viewed as resourceful, and that encourages resilience. So the assets of the individual, the assets of the groups, and the assets of the wider community, which already usually exist, it's just about mobilizing them and making them known. And that's what ABCD stands for. So it's assets-based community development, and this whole process is driven by the community itself. It's us working as a collective, not as an individual. So this all contributes to the RECCAP assessment tool, but what else makes up a good assessment tool and measure in the health sector? So the acronym CHIME. So we all tend to use different IT systems or different assessment processes, but the ones that work most effectively will be the ones that if you base them on this acronym. So in mental health, we have in mental health movement, CHIME refers to, does this assessment or this method connect people? Is it inspiring hope? Is it offering identity? Is there meaning and purpose? And does it encourage empowerment and the ability for that individual to make their own choices? So the RECCAP tool is based on a measure of these things. It ensures to connect people through the methods discussed just now and yesterday. And it's a strengths-based model. So that doesn't mean that we also ignore any weaknesses. It just means that we address problems with strengths from the client and from the community. And the RECCAP utilizes these methods that will offer a shift in social identity to give individuals meaning and purpose. So the engine of change. So this diagram is an excellent way of demonstrating the processes that the RECCAP encourages for an individual's recovery. So the RECCAP assessment starts off with measuring, planning, and engaging an individual. So planning where they want to be, where they want to go, and how they're going to get there. And this process, up until this point, inspires hope, because they have a plan. They have a plan on how they're going to achieve their goals, whatever their goals might be. And this little revolving rectangle, which represents the engine to keep turning, looks at meaning, mentoring, monitoring, and measuring. So this would represent the point where you do the assessment. So you do the assessment at the beginning when you're meeting the client, but then also you do it again in, say, 3 months' time to review where that client's at. And whilst you're doing that, that means that you're checking up on goals and making any changes that need to be made. So you're empowering that person, and over time, there'll be a shift in their identity. So recovery capital. So the RECCAP is based on the idea of recovery capital being used as a means to measure recovery. So with recovery being conceptualized as a process and treated as an ongoing journey, recovery capital refers to the sum of resources that can facilitate the process, and it's a widespread term that's used in a number of different fields. So Granfield and Cloud define recovery capital as the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery from alcohol and other drug problems. They also state that stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of recovery assets, not pathologies. So recovery capital model has a social and community focus rather than a focus on within-body changes and experiences. So the growth of recovery capital as a collective community concept involves mutual empowerment, and it supports and support, but it also manifests itself in improving functioning for the family and wider community. The idea of improved functioning for the family is a really important point, and it's something that I was really pleased to hear was also raised by Sir Mason yesterday, and it's something that I'll definitely be touching on a little bit more later on in this presentation. So this diagram presents the 3 clusters of things predicting how well somebody will do in their recovery. So using data from the studies that David Best conducted in Glasgow, Scotland and Birmingham, he combined it with data from a New York-based study, which is what Lord led on. And they brought their data together, and what they did is they redefined the idea of recovery capital into 3 separate categories. So personal recovery capital. So that includes things such as an individual's level of self-esteem. It includes self-efficacy and their coping skills. And to build and develop on these skills, we need some sort of scaffolding. And this is where social and community recovery capital are required as a focus. So these 2 will provide the framework that then the person can develop within. So social and collective recovery capital provides space for social learning, social control that enable the opportunity to build on those things over time, so that then eventually they can function in this way on their own. So in these studies, the researchers interviewed individuals who considered themselves in recovery. And it was found from this research that the longer the time since their last substance use was associated with better functioning, better physical and physiological health, better quality of life, lower depression and anxiety, less anxiety about using, and higher self-esteem. So one of the core correlates of better functioning across the study population was the impact of social networks, which we know is a key influence of supporting the recovery of someone. And this study just adds to the body of work that demonstrates that recovery needs to be thought of as more than elimination of pathology, and it needs to be thought in terms of enhancing a quality of life and social functioning. So peer support was actually one thing as well that was often cited as a key positive influence for individuals. And the data here is important because it comes from the voices of people who have experience of recovery. So it allows us to understand their views and perceptions to develop and improve support services. And the result of this study was a categorization of these 3 things that can impact recovery. So generating collective recovery capital, which is at the bottom of this pie chart, provides support and hope for those in recovery, and that engages people in a range of activities in the local community. And this process translates into actively participating in community life and giving something back. So the recovery community acts and is seen as a positive force in the local community and a resource, and that goes beyond managing substance misuse issues or just managing offending behavior. So the recovery capital, so the ice cream cone with sprinkles. So Beth Collinson put together this ice cream cone diagram, which I'll share with you today. And she's currently using the RecCap to collect data in her PhD back at Sheffield. So she's one of my peers. And in this model that she's put together, the overall aim is to build recovery capital. So at the bottom of the model, you can see it says something ARC, which stands for Assessment of Recovery Capital. And that's at the bottom of the cone. And the aim from here is to increase personal capital in the form of coping and resilience skills, so self-esteem, self-efficacy, and communication skills, but all through social support. And you've also got SIM, which stands for the Social Identity Model, which you spoke about yesterday. And this is all done at the micro level, so it's all to do with assets-based community development. And as we move further up the cone, you've got asset mapping. And that's what then can link people into the community. And the stars on the top, Beth says, are meant to be the sprinkles on the ice cream. And that results in the community's well-being. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at some of the results some of the results from Florida, where the RECCAP tool is currently being used. So the Florida Association of Recovery Residences. So this is a bunch of dry houses that are currently in Florida, run under this organization. So the people who are living in these dry houses are now trying to sustain recovery and are meant to be abstinent. And what FAR does is they train peer supporters who have lived experience of substance misuse to work as supporters for these individuals. And the peer supporters will use the RECCAP tool in order to collect data and support that individual in their recovery process. So David goes over to Florida to do the 2-day training, and we were both out there earlier this year. And we've had a lot of interest in this over there, and so far it's been quite successful. So I'll talk you through the results that we've got. So if they've got the data that we've got back, this is the first lot of data, is from 170 participants in total. And what they looked at was data collected at baseline, so the assessment was done at the very beginning of perhaps meeting that person, but then also, again, 90 days later. And we looked to see the differences in the recovery capital categories. So one thing to note as well is that for the follow-up study, we had 80 participants worth of data back. And what this graph shows is that there are significant increases in strengths. So in personal recovery capital, social recovery capital, group engagement, and meaningful activities. And the significant decreases in barriers, which were substance misuse, risk-taking, and the proportion of people who lacked meaningful activities. The predictors of change were, well, well-being at 90 days was predicted by recovery capital at 90 days. And recovery capital at baseline was predicted by the strengths, and the strengths included group engagement, support, and commitment, and the barriers were involvement with the criminal justice system. So there's a lot of figures and statements I've probably just thrown at you, but basically what this is showing is that this evidences that a strengths-based recovery model, without disregarding the need to remove barriers to recovery, shows that the RECCAP is effectively measuring somebody's recovery journey. But it's also showing that people are improving in these areas because the tools being used are those that we have discussed, which engage people in their community and encourages social interaction, and it provides connections on many levels. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about desistance from offending. So a lot of the work that I have been involved in looks at offending behavior and substance misuse. So I feel like it's important to talk about some of the similarities between recovery and desistance. So desistance has been defined by McNeil and his colleagues as a process which involves the long-term abstinence from criminal behavior among those whom offending has become a pattern of behavior. So basically, it refers to people to stop committing crime. It's a cessation of offending or other antisocial behavior. And that is often the focus for prisons and probation staff. So how do we get people to desist from crime? What is the answer to reduce reoffending behavior in our population? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's connection. So populations involved in recovery and desistance research have a significant overlaps, as I've already mentioned. And one of the most important overlaps that we've been exploring is the identity change that shifts with this, as I explained, with the social identity model. And that's the same for those in recovery and for those trying to desist. So a paper which has been led by David and also Jamie Irving and Kathy Alberston looks at the emerging recovery movement in alcohol and drug areas and what can be learned for the models of desisting from offending. And I will put the links up on the slides. The only reason I've got shorter slides today is because Dan and I realized yesterday how complicated Prezi can be to use up here. So that's why we're going to have to stick on this slide. I'm just going to have to do a lot of the talking for now. So offending and using networks share similar negative effects because they're both for marginalized groups. so they'll often struggle to access forms of social and community capital. And as we know, it's the progression in these areas that promotes and increases the chances of recovery and maintaining that. So taking it one step further, it's the increases in these capitals that benefit us all, regardless of our backgrounds and struggles, because connections reduce loneliness and improve well-being. The specific exclusions that might be experienced by particular individuals who are stigmatized for offending behavior or drugs and alcohol is difficulties such as accessing housing, jobs, and being excluded from various groups. So John Braithwaite, he's based in Australia and has provided some very valuable research to this field. I know we have a huge fan club in the room for David Best, so if you guys met John Braithwaite, you would be blown away. So he argues that when society's response to offenders is to stigmatize and exclude, they are left with limited opportunity for achieving self-respect and affiliation in socially approved groups. So they become increasingly marginalized. And both populations face the problem not only of overbecoming behavior, but of also convincing friends, family, and the wider community that they really have changed. And this links back to talking about professional buy-in, which I mentioned yesterday when we were talking about limitations and things that can get in the way of us doing this work. So we are those friends, and we are those families, and we are that wider community. But how much do we really believe in what we sell is crucially important, because it will impact on how we work and how we support reducing stigma. So I have an example of a lovely woman who I worked with maybe about 7 years ago, and we were both based in a prison in the UK, in the north. And she was doing some incredible work with people who had learning disabilities in the prison. And she actually had 2 ex-offenders who were living with her in her home, and one of them was very well known in our area and had been very well known in that prison. And the amount of stick that she got for doing that was absolutely ridiculous. People couldn't believe it. They were like, why is he living in your house? And her response was, well, why not? If this is the work that we're doing and this is what we're trying to sell and we're trying to rehabilitate people, why am I not going to give this guy a chance when I truly believe that he has changed? And I'm not saying that you should all go to work on Monday, pick a client and take them home with you. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to get the point across is that we really do need to think about how much we believe in what we're saying. So anyway, back on topic. So dating back to the work of Rex, who has done research in the desistance field, he states that emphasizing the importance of the therapeutic relationship, particularly in probation, is mirrored in the field of recovery as it is in desistance. And McNeil and his colleagues have gone further in discussing the importance of the criminal justice establishing and supporting links to community resources and community groups. So there's vast amounts of research that has been done to support everything that we're saying here today. And Stephen Farrell, who's also based in Sheffield, but at the other university in Sheffield, which some people say is the real university, but... So his study looked at the role of community involvement in the lives of desisters. And one successfully desisted male said, if you don't look after your community, then the community is not going to look after you, and then you'll end up a nobody in society. And I think that's a really powerful thing to have come from a client. So the pathway to desistance and recovery both involves a process. And the process is that it's embedded within social identity change, and it's sustained through increased opportunity to access recovery capital, in particular, in this case, community capital. So it's about accessing opportunities. So not only must we be inspiring hope and belief in recovery, but we also need to provide the access, and that's where it comes through practical means. So now I'd like to talk about some of the actual practical research that's been going on in England. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is, we refer to it as KFC. So that stands for the Kirkham Family Connectors Study. And actually, when David talks about this study, he puts on a slide the actual logo of the fast food restaurant KFC, and quite a few of us are a little bit worried that at some point someone's going to sue us for that, so I've stopped doing that on mine. So Kirkham Family Connectors. Kirkham is an open prison in the UK, so it's known as the Bridging Prison, and it supports initiatives that create bridges for prisoners on their release to support them getting back into the community. So Lauren Hall and David Best led on this particular program, and Lauren is also part of the same research team that I'm in, and she's been currently finishing up her PhD, and her PhD actually focused on this particular study, and she also looked at social identity transitioning and using mapping as a tool for that. So Kirkham Family Connectors is a strengths-based program because it's based on the acronym CHIME, which looks at connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And this particular program invited people into prison, but it also invited their family members. So their family members were asked to take part in 3 workshops, and in those workshops, they had to identify positive assets and groups in the community. So ultimately, they worked as the community connector. So this program so far has been really successful in promoting a sense of hope for all of those involved. And one ex-prisoner actually got in touch quite recently to say that they'd actually lined up a job for when they were going to get released, which is just fantastic. And the data from this study is unpublished at present, but the paper has been authored by Lauren and David on this work, and it's been accepted for publication in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice. The next iteration of the program begins tomorrow, I want to say, but that'll be tomorrow in England, so technically today for us. The time zone thing is still throwing me off a bit. So it's still continuing, so there's still funding for that, which is really great. And the other project that I'd like to talk about is the one that's based in Home House, which is a prison in the UK. So I'll touch on this one briefly. So the REC cap here has been implemented in order to support individuals coming out of prison. So the training only just happened this year, and it was all launched earlier this year as well. And there's about 15 connectors, I believe, who have completed a 2-day training course, and they're going to be using the REC cap tool and rolling it out with their service users. So the connectors in this prison include prison guards, but also people who are in health professionals. So these individuals aren't all working in the same job, but they're working with the same people. So it's not just about recovery from substance misuse or prisoners, it's about anyone who just wants to go on a recovery journey. And the benefit of the individual who's having their assessment using this is that they have a visual tool that they can engage with. So there's an IT-based system which marries up with the REC cap tool. So it means that you can visualize everything on graphs and in color, so it's appealing to the eye. I know I've done many assessments in the past as a key worker, and sometimes it just feels like a paper-based exercise for the client, because you fill out that piece of paper in front of them, and then they don't really see it again. And sometimes it can feel like a box-ticking exercise. However, using this type of assessment tool doesn't do that. And that's because the person who's actually taking part in it has access to it online themselves, so they can do that on their phone or on a computer, and they can map and track their recovery journey themselves. So it gives them a bit more ownership as well. And one of the other good things about the REC cap is that it's quite fluid. So in Florida, that's where the IT system has actually been developed mainly by a team, but Jeremy, who leads on it, I had a conversation with him the other day, and he was telling me that now they've started to marry up the system to change the way that they're working in person. So he was saying that often when a support worker would go meet with their client, trying to do an assessment on the first session was just a bit too much, because it might be that there's some elephants in the room. And when I say elephants in the room, what I'm referring to is that that client might have some issues such as some housing issues going on or a serious personal concern that they need to address before they can sit there and talk to you for an hour about their whole life story. So he said that they've managed to change the system to marry up so that they can have a couple of meetings where they can undertake that work that needs to be done to address those elephants in the room and then do the assessment when it's necessary. Because the key thing here is that we're listening to that person. It's not about us having to tick the boxes and get our assessment done so we can be measuring our outcomes. But at the same time as a worker, to some extent, we do have to capture those outcomes because it's valuable data that shows what we're doing is valuable and often can affect funding. And this is why this IT system is so great, is because we can change it so fluidly to work to however it is that we need to work. So even though it's a tool that can be used across the board, it is tailored to the individual and then not part of another tick box exercise. So, summary and conclusions. So, recovery is a social process, and it's a social network process which is essential. The REC cap is a standardized tool, and it's used to measure and encourage recovery. And every community and individual has assets. It's just about finding and mobilizing them. The importance of bridging connections and hope is at the heart of the recovery process. So for those of you who might be interested, Dave is actually going to be presenting in Auckland in 2018 in January. And the conference that he's going to is to do with drug and alcohol courts. And he'll also be talking about something called desistance capital, which is currently what he's writing his new book on. So he'll have some new research to share with you guys there. And then for everyone coming to the workshop tomorrow, I look forward to seeing you. It should be an interactive session where we'll actually be going through the assessment. So you can see it yourselves and you can work on your iPads, phones, and I've got a few devices with me so we can look at how that actually works. And if anyone who can't make the workshop or couldn't decide which one to go to and is going to another one, wants the information, then just send me over your email address and I'll be happy to share some of that with you. Thank you.